Okay, so thanks for coming today. I was asked to give a talk about startup ecosystems, and I was a little worried because, oh my gosh, there's so much to be said about the startup ecosystem, and there's so many things that go into Silicon Valley, and I finally said, you know what? Why don't I do this? Why don't I focus on the things about Silicon Valley that folks in any geography can actually apply? So that's what I've got today. The fundamental fact is you can't replicate Silicon Valley. A lot of people like to. I went in and I started writing in Silicon Valley of, and as you can see, as far as I can tell, every single possible geography wants to have its own Silicon Valley. But the problem is that Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley because it has 70 years of history behind it. This all goes back to when Bill Hewlett and David Packard were starting Hewlett-Packard in the famous garage in Palo Alto in the 1940s. And gosh, you know, if we want to replicate Silicon Valley in 18 months, that's going to be difficult. So there are things about Silicon Valley that are just hard to make happen. The 70 years of history, the particular weather, the presence of Stanford University and Berkeley as major research universities in this area, the fact that 70% of the world's capital sits in one street in Menlo Park. So these are things that you can't easily replicate, but there are things that you can. Silicon Valley is really an idea, and Steve Jobs has sort of proven this more than anyone else. When he talks about thinking different, that's essentially what Silicon Valley is about. It's about the attitudes and philosophies, not just about the physical nature of the plant or the investors that happen to be here. And so what I'm going to focus on today is talking about how are ways that you can think different in your community to make Silicon Valley style entrepreneurship possible. So the most important lesson is that entrepreneurs are the essential element in the ecosystem. I sort of sat back and said, what is the most important thing here? What is the thing that you cannot do without? And ultimately, it's all about the entrepreneurs. And the reason is, we flip to the next slide, the rest of us are just service providers. Entrepreneurs don't necessarily feel that. They think to themselves, gosh, I have to go up to the venture capitalists on bended knee, wait around in their office because they're never on time, and then kiss their ring when I beg them for their money. And so it's hard to think of venture capitalists and investors as service providers, but they really are. If you think about it, we're all just providing services. Next slide. So, actually, back up one. I thought I had another slide in there. The rest of us are all just service providers. If you think about it, you know, we think of classically service providers like an accounting firm or a law firm. And those are absolutely service providers. But employees are a service provider as well. What they're providing is labor as a service. Investors are service providers. We're providing capital as a service because ultimately, if there were no entrepreneurs, investors would have absolutely no role. So the reason that it's really important to emphasize entrepreneurs is that entrepreneurship isn't economically rational. All the people who are entrepreneurs, which includes most of the people in this room apparently, you're fundamentally pursuing an activity that is economically irrational. The numbers, even in Silicon Valley, are stacked against you in a wild way. Out of every 1,000 companies that seek angel funding, only 6 make money for investors. Another truism is that 1/10 of companies that seek funding will receive it. 1/10 of those companies that receive venture capital funding will actually be successful, i.e. return a significant amount of money to investors. So if you multiply those out, you very quickly get to a state where failure is the default for 99% of the time. And in fact, Noam Wasserman, who's a professor at Harvard Business School, conducted an extensive study of entrepreneurs that showed that the monetary return on entrepreneurship, the average monetary return, actually lagged working in corporate America. So given all these things, why do entrepreneurs do this? Well, that's a good question. The reason why entrepreneurs do this is because fundamentally they are gamblers. They are risk seekers. They see the value of the upside as opposed to concentrating on the downside. And this is important. This actually explains why entrepreneurs do worse economically, because the entrepreneurs don't have option value. When I was at Harvard Business School, Bill Salmon was my professor for entrepreneurial finance. And he explained to me that venture capital is all about poker. Now, what he meant by that is that when you're playing poker, I'm not a poker player, so anybody who is a poker player, correct me if I'm wrong. But when I'm playing poker, you have a number of cards that are laid face down. And in each round, you place bets, and then you turn over another card. And he said that is essentially the value that venture capital brings. Venture capital is paying an incremental amount to turn over the next card. So it's not like when you have an idea, the venture capitalist says, how much money you're going to need to get public? 35 million? Sounds great. Here's 35 million. Instead, the venture capitalists get their returns by being able to say, all right, here's $1 million. Oh, that worked out. Here's $5 million. Oh, that worked out. Here's $25 million. So the option value is where all the value comes from, by being able to cut the losers and double down on the winners. Now the problem is entrepreneurs don't have option value. As far as I know, in this country, it is impossible for you to own 200% of a company. Right, let's say you're an entrepreneur. You start a company. It seems to be successful. Great, let me double down. Let me increase my 100% stake to 200%. Doesn't work that way. So again, entrepreneurs are pursuing an economically irrational course that doesn't give them the same value that all the rest of the members of the community have. Wow, that's pretty amazing. So that leads into lesson 2, which is to make it really easy for entrepreneurs to start companies before they wise up to this situation. So this is a cartoon from Hugh MacLeod, who cartoons at Gaping Void. He draws cartoons at the backs of business cards. And as he put it, entrepreneurs don't need money, entrepreneurs need blood. Essentially, entrepreneurship is an irrational activity that people go into because they can't imagine doing anything else. And if we have people who are so good as to be willing to sacrifice their own happiness, their own financial well-being in order to make our ecosystem better, we got to do everything we can to help them out. So Silicon Valley wins because it's all about reducing the friction of company formation. If a friend of mine came to me and said, Chris, I have a great idea. I want to start a company. I would say, fantastic. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go find a law firm that will defer all the billings so you can get the company set up. We're going to find employees and co-founders who will work for free so that you don't have to come up with any money. And then we're going to go ahead and find some angel investors who are crazy enough to give you money even though you don't have anything. And you can do that in Silicon Valley. And it's because we're reducing the friction of company formation. Now, the reason you want to reduce the friction of company formation is that it gets you to success or failure faster. This is kind of counterintuitive. Reducing the friction to start the companies doesn't make them any more likely to be successful. I mean, as we saw, 1% of companies end up being successful. But reducing the friction shortens the cycle time. And start to think from an operations perspective, because a lot of you guys have an operations research background. If you shorten the cycle time, each given entrepreneur can actually start more companies in their career. If you shorten the cycle time, companies that are losers get identified as losers more quickly and recycled into the ecosystem. Silicon Valley is phenomenal about recycling. There's a great quote from Steve Blank, who is the father of customer development and the godfather of the lean startup. And his quote is, do you know what we call a failed entrepreneur in Silicon Valley? Experienced. We recycle the people, we recycle the hardware. I mean, ask any entrepreneur. Most of the time, when their laptop comes from a previous company, their office supplies come from a previous company, everything is recycled. And because ultimately Silicon Valley reduces the friction so much, what we've done is per given entrepreneur, we're able to throw that many more companies out there. So instead of starting 1 company per entrepreneur in their career, we're starting 10 companies per entrepreneur in their career. And so the success of Silicon Valley ultimately comes from speeding up, acting as a catalyst to the entrepreneurial process. Ultimately, success or failure is still up to the entrepreneur. The fact that Silicon Valley makes it easy to start companies doesn't make it easy to exit and generate these huge returns. The reason there is a Facebook or a LinkedIn or a Google or an Apple is not because people in Silicon Valley are smarter, it's because there are 10 times more failures or 100 times more failures than in other places, but the successes outweigh them and the successes build upon each other. The final thing to remember is this: entrepreneurs are optimists. Noam Wasserman, same study, interviewed these entrepreneurs. 81% of them think their startup will succeed. Which makes sense. Why would you start a company if you don't think you're going to succeed? The reason is he interviewed people who are several years into entrepreneurship. I mean, ultimately, every entrepreneur believes, I'm going to succeed. but 81% were convinced. I think 70% said there was no chance they could possibly fail. Now, as we saw, there's like a 99% chance they're going to fail. But that's the beauty of entrepreneurs. They have this incorrigible optimism, this desire to create. And all you have to do is remove the obstacles. Now, that's easier said than done. But the key is you have an entire ecosystem. You try to find ways to reduce the friction. That means working with the service providers like lawyers and attorneys. That means working with the investors. That means making it easier and easier for companies to form. If you're able to make it easier for companies to form, more companies will form, more companies will be successful, and you'll be able to generate that virtuous circle that has made Silicon Valley great. The thing that most people believe sets Silicon Valley apart is that Silicon Valley has such a long history of entrepreneurship. There are so many successful entrepreneurs who are giving back as angel investors or as venture capitalists. There's this deep bench of mentors. Well, the only reason Silicon Valley has a deep bench of mentors is because it failed so many times in the past. The more startups you start, the more startups are going to be successful. The more startups that are successful, the more successful entrepreneurs there will be to give back and make the ecosystem powerful. So ultimately, that's what it's all about. It's all about the entrepreneurs. And because we can't fundamentally change the entrepreneurs, our goal is simply to reduce the friction to those entrepreneurs producing more companies. And that's it. You can follow me on Twitter at Chris Ye, and many people like to do that. I should also mention one other thing, which is that since I'm in the room with all these people who run a series of accelerators and incubators, one of the companies that I have invested in, PB Works, makes collaboration software. One of the things we're planning to do later on this year is to introduce a program where we actually donate our software to every incubator or accelerator who wants it, so that you can give it to your companies as well. It's not a permanent donation forever. I mean, if they become Microsoft, we obviously want to charge them money for it. But we feel like it's a great way to give back to the startup community and to get people more into our product earlier on. So I'll have business cards, and we can definitely talk about that later on as well. Thanks a lot.
Cool.
So hopefully I was able to get through that quickly.
That was fabulous.
Hello.
Chris, I've got a question, and so I'm just bursting, and hopefully everyone else can ask their questions after. So having spent quite, 12, 13 years in Europe, I see that the atmosphere or cultures there, particularly Ireland, was very different about failure.
Yes.
And in fact, how I launched my career here was I failed. And
the best way to succeed in Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. What you've just said is actually accurate as far as my experience here too. However, my question is, how do we change what's happening in other cultures when that very negative viewpoint about failure is there, basically?
Got it.
Do you have any ideas?
Absolutely. Well, this is where having a member of parliament is helpful, because there are public policy areas around failure. I mean, one of the reasons why failure is relatively consequence-free here in Silicon Valley is because, if you fail, we do have corporations versus personal. There's no personal liability. You're not saddled with debts for the rest of your life. If you fail, you fail. And so being able to have a firm corporate veil that enables entrepreneurs to fail without ruining their lives is important. And so from a public policy standpoint, that's something to put in place. From an attitude standpoint, I think that what helps is things like this program where people are coming from all around the world to Silicon Valley. Each of you guys is highly influential in your home community. And you're going to go back and you're going to say, hey, let's do things to reduce the friction. Let's do things to encourage this. It isn't easy, and it'll probably take some time. But I think you've witnessed. I mean, just imagine 10 years ago the level of commitment to startups that exist in your communities. And it's nowhere near what it is today, thanks in part to guys like you. Other questions?
Yeah, and let's make it a discussion. Like each of you can share something around these topics, what's going on in your country, and like it's not only from Chris.
Exactly. No. In fact, I'll sit down.
Each of you is a
so it doesn't seem like you have to.
Is a contributor to this discussion.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Chris, you had a very good point saying that making it easy doesn't to start something doesn't make it easy to exit. But how do we find this balance? To which extent and where exactly? Is it in terms of starting a company, or is it in terms of getting money?
Right.
My conclusion with our companies, sometimes I wish they had less money.
Ah, yes.
Sometimes I wish they
Absolutely.
had more troubles, starting a company, so they appreciate how business is done.
Yes.
But at the same time, as a public policy specialist, I understand that if we create, barriers for the company to start their activity, they may never find their first client.
Right. I mean, I think that you can see this happening even in this country. In this country, typically the government has a hands-off policy, but there are instances where the government attempts to pick winners by placing large loan guarantees in place and the like. Some of you who may be familiar with the name Solyndra, for example, which is a company that consumes several $100 million of government money. So my own personal feeling on this is that the government can't pick winners. Why? Because venture capitalists can't pick winners. I mean, it's all a crapshoot. It's not like Sequoia has a 70% success rate. What they have is a 10% success rate and a 90% success rate at burying their failures quietly so that no one knows that it's existed. And in fact, you'll find that they've disappeared mysteriously from their website after they fail. So I think you're absolutely right. The answer is not, from a policy standpoint, to sort of funnel large amounts of capital into a chosen few startups. It's to encourage the broad starting of companies. I think that it is true that when it gets really easy to raise money, like it is easier to raise money in Silicon Valley now than it typically is. That doesn't mean it's easy, but it's easier. That means a lot of bad companies get funded. And a lot of people are going down the path. The good news is, seed stage funding can only take people so far. It's not like if you give people $250,000 that they'll be able to live on that for 4 years consuming resources. The answer is to keep the bets small so that even if they go wrong, it doesn't cause as many problems, and so that they're forced to face up to the facts of success or failure sooner. You see these companies with an experienced executive like Color, for example. They raised $41 million. Well, they actually did the right thing and shut down the company. But in many cases, that's not going to happen. If you have $41 million sitting around, you can make a lot of mistakes before you run out of money.
Yeah.
And so I'm definitely an advocate of the classic venture capital model of small bets that let you turn over the next card so that you could then see if you want to double down.
Really quickly on your point, so I'm working with the Prime Minister in Lebanon, and they did a feasibility study on Singapore because they assumed that Singapore has created this ecosystem. And part of the discussion was interviewing entrepreneurs, and a lot of the entrepreneurs were saying that the government almost made it too easy and it's not really challenging. So what I think around the world, what actually drives the kind of early stage companies the most is very small money and good angels or mentors and advisors. So the example I like to use, I've met 400 companies in the Middle East, and only 6 of them had any US advisors, mentors, investors, angels, and that's the disconnect. So in your case, in the Ukraine, I know a friend of mine is actually running something there too, Parish. I don't know if you know him.
Rish?
Yeah.
He's
We're
our
working
partner.
together.
Ah,
There you go.
I actually met David. That's David's friend.
That's what I figured.
Yeah,
I saw David's picture on the Startup Monthly thing. I was
Yeah.
like, oh, he was here
Yeah.
first.
David traveled with us to Moscow in September.
David is
The founder of PB Works, which is the
and
company
he
that I
actually
invested in,
recommended
is
him.
an old friend of mine
we
as
talked
well.
about 5-6 months ago when I was in Dubai. But the point is that creating that support network is more valuable than the money, I think. The network that really mentors companies, with Founder Institute,
Yeah.
basically it's every week you either pivot, you make it, you don't make it, and then if you don't make it, you give up and you start something else. So I think as a policy that you want to build in a country, don't focus so much on the money and investors. Focus on building a supportive ecosystem with all the components. And I think the angel / advisor ones, the role that they play is probably the most important in that. So it's not always the money.
And the good news is you can borrow a lot of those people from Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
I think that part of what I see as an angel investor in Silicon Valley is I saw an email from an entrepreneur the other day saying, oh, I'm thinking about raising my seed round. What do you think about a $25 million pre-money valuation? what? They're nuts. And so I think that there is, investors in Silicon Valley want to help people in general, want to spread, are evangelists for Silicon Valley. I think would be open to potentially working with you and helping you out. And I think the other thing is, frankly, there aren't a lot of bargains in Silicon Valley anymore, but they very well be bargains overseas. I think Dave McClure over at 500 Startups, whom you're going to visit later on this week, is one of the foremost advocates of this. I almost feel like I tell people, I think Dave's secret plan is make a lot of noise in the United States and make some investing in the United States, but invest the bulk of his money overseas, taking advantage of the notoriety he's built in the United States. I always tell people that's his secret plan.
Yeah, valuations are 5 to 8 times lower.
Exactly.
At the stage, so you can get A round value at a seed stage anywhere basically. And I think I like what you said earlier about staying away from clones. I mean, clones are not bad, inherently bad businesses, but I don't think that they're exciting and sexy.
You have to have a huge domestic market. That's why like the German clones often work, the Chinese clones work, because they got a giant market. Russian clones.
Turkey's doing well in that. So
Exactly.
Yeah, having Russia next to us is not helpful. Because the moment we start doing clones,
They already have it.
Yeah, they already have it. We have common language. It's very hard to listen to. But I think Israel had a very good.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to comment. Dave McClure was actually in Israel this past week. He gave a couple of public presentations, but in one of them he goes through the stages, which I think everybody here is familiar with. And but what he wasn't really addressing is that, for example, in Israel there's a funding gap, not in the accelerator stage. I think just in terms of building an ecosystem, everybody rushes to the accelerator. Israel's had an explosion of accelerators over the past 2 years. Now, if you wanted to do a panel of accelerators that would fill this room, people running accelerators, which is a wonderful, a nice thing. But what happens is the typical, and myself and my partner do micro-angel investments as well, so up to $25,000 for a startup. The trouble is that there are a lot of companies now who've gotten the proverbial $25,000 or $50,000,
Right.
and then there's a vast desert.
Yeah, that's everywhere.
Right,
That's
right. The local
yeah.
VC community, depending on which takes you out, is somewhere between dead and dormant, and especially in the areas that we're talking about. Like, for example, I challenged one leading Israeli VC who has money and wants to invest, and I said, and this is the question of when you're investing in technology or what types of companies and so on, and it's that diversity that Silicon Valley has that I think is missing. Anyway, I challenged him and I said, would you invest in any of Y Combinator's class of this year? And he said, no. And I said, you see, that's the major gap that we have. So I think that's something I think Israel's dealing with. I think everybody, but it's slowly changing. Sell a few companies to Facebook, and actually one thing I did want to challenge you on in terms of Silicon Valley and get your response,
Absolutely.
which I think would be helpful for everyone, is that what we see is this centrifugal force of Silicon Valley at work, right? So sell a company to Facebook, it gets pulled to Facebook. Now, yes, Google and to a lesser degree, we set up some local operations, but it still is, in terms of an exit play. For entrepreneurs and for anybody investing in them, the ones who get acquired are the ones who have the connections to the upper management or board people at Google, Facebook,
And it is that is the dual-edged sword of bringing Silicon Valley to your community. I mean, Silicon Valley is successful because it steals brains from everywhere else in the world. It steals companies from everywhere else in the world, and it's no surprise. I mean, one of the reasons why a program like Y Combinator or any of these other programs is successful is because the smartest people from all around the world come here and they participate in the program, and then many of them don't end up leaving. I went to Stanford as an undergraduate. There were many people at Stanford who came from the East Coast, different places, maybe a little colder, not quite as pleasant. Very few of them went back. And so it is a danger, but I think it's something that you kind of have to go through. At least some of the people will decide, you know what, I want to return back to the community and give back. Some of them are not. Some of them are going to say, you know what, I'm going to set up shop in Atherton and just enjoy life. But you have to, you need those successful entrepreneurs, you need those successful exits, and right now those exits are primarily through acquisition, especially if the capital markets aren't developed enough to allow a public offering of significant size. So I think you're absolutely right, it is a danger, but there's a greater danger in not having that activity occur.
I just wanted to add, two of my companies actually got 50K from Dave McClure, and the way we're able to do that, literally it was to get Dave McClure to the Grow Conference in Canada and get him out drinking and 2 in the morning. I love you, done. That's the company I'm investing in. So this, I mean, and for Canada, we have been really lucky, but just something I wanted to share with you is we've developed what's called the C100. It's a group of Canadian expats who support our Canadian companies who are here. So any companies that go through our Accelerator program get C100 mentoring. And the C100 group is really something wonderful because, for example, Patrick Bichette, number 2 at Google, he's a C100, so he comes and mentors this company. So we really, and this is what you said, like the companies who are going to have the success are the companies who are going to have some key contact here in the Valley, kind of take them on and say, hey, this is the company that's hot, and they're the person who's going to open doors. So at least for my program, I focus on getting the right advisor to the company because they open all the doors. And just the C100, it's a great program. Any country should try to duplicate. A third of them are investors. A third of them are, industry executives. And another third of them are entrepreneurs who had successful exits. So last year, we're lucky we got 114 million invested back in our Canadian startups that are here. And so this is just kind of just what you're saying. This is a new school of thought. Even though, talent is leaving your country, you just don't know what benefit you can actually give back to your startup. It's just interesting.
And if you look at it, I mean, China is a great example of a country where there were a lot of immigrants from China to the United States. Many of them made a home here, built companies here, developed a community here. Just go down to Cupertino, you'll see what I mean. But now, increasingly, people come from China to the United States for education, to maybe work, but then return to China because there's such a vast market and so many opportunities there. I often tell people, hey, if you have a chance to go to China, an emerging market where there's still a lot of things in play, you're probably going to do even better than you are here. I can't speak Mandarin worth a damn, and I, as I've mentioned, don't even drive to San Francisco, so I'm not back in China. But I do advise a lot of people, hey, you know what? You can have this whole cycle where you export your brains to the United States, but eventually the diaspora reverses, and you begin to have a reverse brain drain.
So one of the things I want to kind of highlight is that this accelerator phenomenon is kind of what I call the realtor syndrome. When the housing market was booming, everybody all of a sudden became an expert at being a realtor or mortgage broker. And the reality still is that only 10% of the realtors made money. And I think a lot of efforts now are obviously amazing to start these accelerator programs, but we always said, what happens after? And what the phrase we used was the wind comes out of the sail. So the phase right after the accelerator is the most critical because getting someone started and having an actual vision and a minimal viable product or pitch deck is obviously kind of the root. But unless you water that plant right afterwards, many companies and accelerators will not make it because they don't have that support network afterwards. And the reason why a Dave McClure or a Y Combinator are now so powerful is because that supportive network around them is already done. So Y Combinator has, I think, 1,100 mentors. What Dave's doing now is that he's kind of intermingling the entrepreneurs within his companies to be advisors and mentors to the other ones. So it's in a sense, even with Founder Institute, it's kind of a co-op model where everybody supports each other and everybody kind of helps. And even some of the companies may be competitive, but they're really trying to open doors. And I think the idea of being a connector is almost more important than a mentor at that phase. The mentoring should be done in the program, while the product's being built, and you obviously want to have people involved, but the phase right after is where I think a lot of efforts are going to fail because the support network, the angel network, and that gap is too big.
Right, I mean, but Y Combinator, for example, what happened was people sometimes forget is that very quickly developed, the check for every company coming out of Y Combinator. So it's not the beer money and piece of money for 3 months. It's a longer runway. so that you have time to run around trying to raise your, whatever you want to call it, seed round or the next round of capital. And that, you know, you can call it month 4, if you want, for a good name of a venture fund, which is, you know, focusing on all these people coming out of the usual 3 months of an acceleration program in a month.
So
they don't have the Y Combinator.
Just to comment on that, we work with Steve Blank as advisor, and you know, from the last meeting, one of the things that we learned is that we are building the last pivot accelerator, meaning that there are lots of all these accelerators around the world that incubate ideas, kind of polish them, and we provide them the last step in the valley where they arrive, and we help them to do the seed round. And kind of this is what we're gonna start doing from April. Right now we have one kind of fresh startup in the accelerator out of 4, others a bit more mature. But starting from the next year, we're gonna be kind of position it as the last pivot accelerator.
Well, Techstar is also doing the same.
Okay.
So what some of the accelerators in Europe are doing, and we are going to start doing ourselves, is to provide follow-on money if the startup is able to raise some funding. So let's say the startup is able to raise like 100,000, then we provide, you know, we also pitch in, so they get validation from the market, because we also want that validation to happen. But at the same time, they know that we are continuing. That makes it easier for them to raise that little bit of follow-on money, and to have it structured so it's almost like the same pool of investors that are repeatedly investing in those startups coming out of a particular accelerator. Startup Bootcamp is doing that in Europe. We are about to start the same, and I think that makes it a little bit easier, because there is definitely a huge death valley right after.
Really quick, I'm sorry, please.
And I think our issue in Ukraine, and I'm sure it's the same for you, it's not only that they don't have flow on money, but the real issue is they don't have traction. They live outside of the customers they are trying to get to their, you know, I'd say no one would die without money, but they would all die if they don't have appropriate traction. Steve Blank said that you need to have about 5 or 7% on a weekly basis of your growth of user base. Now we are like looking at each of our company and yelling at them and saying, well, where is your traction? We went to New York in May, and I talked to all the funds, and they said, well, we don't mind that they are Ukrainian. We don't even mind that they are out there. We only care for the 7% to show on their dashboard, so we can see real traction. And they need to get to the Silicon Valley or to Boston, to New York, whatever. Anywhere they can get their millions of clients, because they need to work with them, and having an angel investor is crucial to them. Angel who is seriously working with the team, advisor, angel.
Yeah, I would even say that looking at the smaller companies that I worked with, we tend to be right at that stage where they're starting to talk to customers, and the scary part about that is that it's something they should have started long before. Exactly. And this is the same problem. You know, you would think that people in Silicon Valley who have seemingly more direct access to customers than companies in places where the local market isn't as large, it's the same problem, right? So I would almost say if I was running an incubator or an accelerator or a month 4 kind of, my first requirement would be how many customers, okay, you don't have a product yet, how many customers have you had conversations with? Yeah. Actual real customers. And I mean, if it takes putting them on a plane and forcing them to go, this is epidemic.
Yeah, but we follow the lean startup approach, and you can't go very low without that customer development. It's embedded into the incubation program that you need to measure, iterate. So
yeah, but they interview wrong people. If they target U.S. market, they interview people in Ukraine. They don't get the right people.
They go.
No, but these people might be in a mall. If you are creating fashion app, and you must be in the mall in Westfield,
No,
and you
absolutely,
cannot do
there's a
it from
disadvantage.
Ukraine.
Yeah, there's absolutely a disadvantage of being, away,
Yeah.
and that's why we're also looking into having that base in the U.S. That they can
Maybe
come.
we can collaborate, all of us, and create some short, like 2 weeks program that they are coming and doing customer development, then they're going back and building. I don't know.
2 weeks is.
That-
Or-
Customer development is something you need to do every week.
I know, but
Yeah.
it's impossible to do it
track
from
the
there.
7%.
I
And,
think
so
what you mentioned about kind of matching funds is obviously great. The problem is that the biggest hurdle or the biggest inefficiency in this whole thing isn't the product, the company, it's the fundraising. So the fundraising takes up a lot of time, it's very inefficient, and to be honest, it's ultimately based on one real thing. It's based on relationships. And the reason why Jakob was saying basically the guaranteed money that Y Combinator's company get is that in reality, they only they buy themselves more time where they don't have to go out and fundraise, and then automatically, one of the mentors that's already connected happens to know the so-and-so here who, or the investor here who invests in this vertical. He makes one phone call, because the reality is, like Chris was saying, it is playing poker. 90% of the time when you're talking to an investor, he may be knowledgeable, but he's not an expert at what you're doing, and he might have a gut feeling. And the way these deals happen is that he calls someone that he's done a deal with before and says, hey, there's a kid in here, and he's onto something, he seems kind of crazy enough to do it, and I have a gut feeling. And kind of like what I think Dave, the reason why he's good, he's gut feeling on the spot, done. And then again, what's $50,000? Nothing. It's the network. So what I would say for you guys, as far as the matching funds, try to eliminate the part of where the companies waste a bunch of time trying to raise money in a very difficult money raising market. So I would assume that it's pretty time consuming even to raise small amounts of money. So try to figure out that gap or bridge that gap and buy them a little bit more time based on maybe milestones or maybe doing customer discussions or whatever it is. Like, give them really aggressive milestones where they have to meet those, and based on that, give them small chunks of money, not based on them having gotten other investors involved. Because that process, I think 90% of companies fail because that process is the most inefficient kind of bullshit thing that you have to go through, and deep down you're struggling. Like, I know I'm onto something. I built something incredible, and you're trying to prove something without customer traction, without a product that's live, and it's really just gut feeling and relationship. That's all it is.
But here's the problem. Even in Silicon Valley, I tell people all the time, go out and get some traction. You don't want to have to spend all your time job owning people and convincing them that you've built something great. You want to just point and say, look, the evidence is there. And I find that when companies have traction, it's very easy for them to raise money. And when they don't have traction, it's very hard, even if they know the investors. Investors, I mean, we like people, but we'll invest in. Liking allows us to say, okay, I'll give you a little bit of money for super seed round just to figure out what you're doing. And I did that with David's most recent company. He said, hey, I'm raising just a little bit for my friends. I'm like, okay, I'm in. But that doesn't get you to the point of, okay, now we're doing $1 million round. If you're doing $1 million round, you better have real traction, because otherwise you're going to spend 6 months trying to find someone to say yes and failing.
And that 6 months is much better spent on a strategic partnership, on a distribution deal, a pilot, and it may not always be Microsoft or Google or Yahoo or Facebook, but if you can get a strategic deal done that validates your model, I like to call the concept transferring the burden of distribution. If you can get a bigger brand to help you kind of get to the market, that's more valuable than money, I think. So creating those bridges.
On that point, we're just going to wind up now. Do you have any further points?
No,
to make,
I think that it's been very enjoyable. Glad to meet you guys. I have plenty of business cards if you want to get in touch with me. I always warn everyone that I'm so busy that it usually takes me a long time to get back in touch, but I do want to reach out to you guys, so I'll
Yes.
have them here.
Don't take it personally, even people that know him. It takes a while to get through.
Well, Bemo can tell you that it took 2 weeks of asking me, begging me, can you tell me what the talk is going to be about? And I think it was.
You delivered it last night.
You needed to know Friday, and so I sent you Thursday night what the talk was going to be about, and then last night at 10 p.m. I sent you the slides.
Yeah,
so,
no, he was great, but don't take it personally. Thanks so much, Chris.